fire. This is about how to refactor your code, how to make the decision on whether to do it, best practices on how to go about it, and then also how to actually get your team and your company management, other people kind of on board with this process, since we aren't always just allowed to do whatever the hell we want, whenever the hell we want as developers. So, my name is Morgan. I am a Colorado native. I was born in Boulder County. I have Sheeta Eves, and I drink whiskey, and I like to run. And I also race cars, and I've been a front-end programmer since about 2012. So that is kind of my little spiel. I was working for TAC Mobile, who was kind enough to help sponsor this event. I am now on the No Fucks Given Summer Tour of 2016, and we'll be starting with Quick Left in September. So that's where you can find me after this. So, before we move on actually, so a quick poll, has anyone here ever been faced with a code base that you really wish you could completely rewrite it, refactor it, stuff like that? Sweet!
Unfortunately, I wrote it myself.
Yeah.
If I look back at something I wrote 6 weeks ago and I'm not appalled by what I wrote, then I know I'm doing something wrong. So, I'm with you on that one. All right, cool. So, you guys are the perfect audience for this. Alright, so, has this ever happened to you? I found this gift from like an infomercial fails. So that's somewhere in the world on an infomercial. I have no clue what they're trying to sell. But sometimes I feel like trying to maintain or add onto a code base is kind of like trying to shove a banana in a beer bottle. The project specifications have changed enough, what the client want has changed, the framework's irrelevant, the text's irrelevant, whatever it is, and it's just not going to happen anymore. So you're faced with a couple of things. You can either try to make it work, or you can essentially break up with your code base and move on. So some things that might be kind of red flags are that the code is legacy code. And I'm going to jump into really what that means here in a minute. Because legacy code can mean a lot of different things, and it doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means. The other thing would be code instability. Every time you do a production push, something new breaks. The site is just generally very unstable. It has performance problems. You just can't do anything ever. Going in to do a simple bug fix can take hours, not 15 to 30 minutes. There are performance issues with the site, especially with the front end. When frameworks get outdated, performance tends to be one of the first things that takes a hit. With back end, it's a little bit different, but even then, if you're trying to talk to a database that's faster than your API or vice versa, then you're going to start experiencing performance lags. And the other thing is just maybe company standards have changed. Maybe you're integrating with a client's code base and their standards have changed. Maybe the product isn't what it was at MVP launch. There are a lot of different factors to consider when you're looking at a code base and deciding, oh, this is just simply no longer relevant to what it needs to be and what it's going to be either for version 2.0 or a site redesign or a new integration or something like that. So, let's talk about the differences between rewriting and refactoring, because they are two separate things. Rewriting is a full just tear down and rebuild. It's shoving everything off to the side as much as you can and basically rebuilding the application from the ground up. This could be just back end, this could be just front end. Maybe you're using a really old framework, maybe you're using Moo tools. Maybe you actually need to add a framework. To me, that would be considered a rewrite. If you are basically tearing down and completely rebuilding any core component of an application or of a site, that would be considered a rewrite. You're going to make sweeping changes throughout the entire app. Refactoring is a little more specific. It's also a little bit more manageable. Rewriting can be very, very high risk, especially if you're going from one language or one framework to another. There's a lot of risk involved with rewrites. Refactoring, on the other hand, it's a very targeted approach. You're going to strategically go in and make incremental changes over time. Just take baby steps, eat that elephant one bite at a time. And I'll go into a little more detail of the subtle nuances of how those two things work together. So now let's jump into like what is legacy code? This has been a major talking point for a little while. Legacy code seemed like a good idea at the time, but it's not anymore. So One of my main criterias for legacy code is the age of the code base versus the actual character of the code itself. Legacy code doesn't just mean that somebody like shoved a bunch of code in a bunch of crappy places and you can't figure out what the hell is going on. Legacy code can be very well written, and it's just irrelevant for whatever reason. Maybe the application has just taken such a wide departure from what it was when that first release of the code base went out. It no longer meets the needs of your organization if you're a product company, if you're a client services company, either because your product has shifted, what your client wants has shifted. And I ran into this working for a daily deal site that is slowly dying. And we were running into an issue where we needed to pivot the business model of the company. Well, the entire daily deals model of the site was no longer generating revenue. It was no longer lucrative. And so at that point, we said, okay, well, we need to start adding on new features that change the nature of how we do business. And in that situation, pretty much all of the daily deals code more or less became legacy code at that point, because there was no way for us to shoehorn in all of these new features we wanted to do for the company pivot and still make it all work together. So we essentially created a startup within the company to start building this separate application that integrated very loosely with the service-oriented architecture that we had existing. But at the end of the day, it was basically a crack team of about 10 of us who were put together to build a completely separate application separate from the site. And now at this point, all of that old code that's maintaining the former part of the site is slowly being picked apart and gone through. They're trying to figure out kind of what to do with it at this point. But eventually, probably that entire component of the business model and that entire code base will start to get phased out over time. That's already kind of happening. The company has sold off shares for certain components of the site and certain types of deals that they're running. And so those categories, basically that code is now getting ripped out. And I worked with a front-end engineer there, and she deleted 10,000 lines of code in 1 quarter. So in 3 months, she got 10,000 lines gone. And it was redundant scripts, it was redundant styles, that kind of thing. And so that is something that you can go in and do as well. It's just start like doing a little bit of housekeeping initially, see, you know, what's no longer relevant to the business model, what's no longer needed. She removed like entire style sheets basically. And it worked to the benefit of the site. Made it a little bit lighter. It meant for less digging. If you had to go in and maintain anything, you didn't have to do quite as much of a needle in a haystack hunt to get to stuff that you needed to get working. So another big red flag of legacy code is that you actually can't add to it sometimes. I've worked in applications where the client will say, oh, hey, can we add this new feature where this component's highlighted when you select it? That should, in theory, I think I sized it at a 2-hour effort, took 3 days because the code was so spaghetti that there was no way to efficiently go in to the existing functions and simply add a piece of functionality that said like, hey, when you click it, highlight the damn thing. And then save that selection and persist it for the user. And so something that seems like a pretty easy client request, it's a single sentence. The story was sized accordingly based on what the code base should have been. But in fact, what it was a 3-day effort, and the client going, what the hell is taking so long is the problem here. Another thing that tends to happen with front end is that frameworks get phased out really, really fast. Usually the first year that a framework is alive within the front end universe, it's the most volatile time period for that framework. User adoption can be either super fast or super slow, and then depending on who's maintaining it, it can rise up very quick like Angular and Ember have, or it can crash and burn. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time for something to get phased out. Like as time goes on, I see less and less of sites using something like Backbone, things like that, but they're still kind of keeping a stronghold in the universe. So that can be part of it too. Maybe it's just that a component of this technology is just no longer around, or it's, you know, .NET updates to a new version, or Rails comes up to a new version, and then you get to add insecurities and things like that. So those kinds of things can happen. So those are all just different factors that can actually create legacy code. It's not just that it was written in Perl or was written in .NET 2.5. It's actually just code that is no longer really relevant to the specific application of what you need to use it for. All right, so we've gone over some different factors as to what makes a good rewrite refactor candidate. So now let's say that you've looked at your application, you're like, yes, I really want to do this. And, sorry, I'm just checking time real quick as we move through here. Okay, perfect. And so you want to start kind of looking at, okay, I want to rewrite or refactor this application. How do you go about that? To me, you should always start basically like you're going to build a new application from the ground up. Even if you're refactoring, you need, I think that's like the first thing that I ever learned when I started going to school for coding is understand the problem. What is it that you're delivering? What is it you're creating for the client? Because maybe the existing application as it is not actually in the customer's best interests. So the flip side of that is that rewriting or refactoring that code base may actually not be to the customer's benefit. Maybe you want to do it because it's super frustrating to work in that code base, but it's either going to introduce a ton of vulnerabilities, it's going to diminish user experience, maybe it even diminishes performance to try to improve a code base. And so those are other things to consider, and I'll kind of dive into that and how you can examine those kind of factors in a little bit. Well, let's just say that, yes, you found something that's a good candidate. You say, yes, I want to move forward. Let's rewrite this thing, or let's refactor it and see if we can get some wins there. So one thing that companies and individuals tend to fight against is like, well, this is how we've always done it, so this is the way we should do it. Unless a company has hard, fast standards on how they're going to build shit, that should give you a little bit of leeway and some wiggle room to say like, hey, you know what, this totally isn't working right. We need to redo this. And I'll go into some factors as to what can help you kind of tailor that argument. But let go of that idea that like, just because it's the way somebody's always done it doesn't mean it's the best way to do it. And we can talk about working examples of that like all day long on how that works. This is why we don't have horse and buggies anymore. The other thing is just take a step back, take stock of the application. What's it doing? What does it need to do? How is it maybe not fulfilling the full requirements of what the client wants? Maybe the client has already communicated, or your product team if you're working on an internal product. Maybe there's communication already about what the expectations are down the road. Definitely take a step back and look at all those different factors because you really want to see the bigger picture here, not just get super granular of like, oh, this Angular app, the controllers are 800 lines long. I need to break this into services and directives, and then you just start like copy pasting like a mad person. And then pretty soon, you've just kind of created, two means to the same end. And maybe it's in smaller files, but it's still not doing its job. And that's kind of the whole point of rewriting and refactoring is that you want to make that application better. You just don't want to break stuff into smaller files or separate your data layer a little bit better or abstract stuff out a little bit more just for the hell of doing it. You actually want to improve stuff, and you want to leave the code in a better place than you found it for the next sucker who's going to come on and take your job and work on that code base. So as you're making these decisions, definitely get a team together. Even if you have to create some kind of skunkworks team to do this, just get other people's opinions. It's really easy to work in a silo, but then once you start pushing your code out there, it's really easy to basically screw yourself because we're only just one person a piece. Other people can have other considerations. They wouldn't even have to be on the same team as you. You might want to pull in UX designers, product people, account people, biz dev, management, and say, hey, I think this is a good case scenario. Can we talk about this? Kind of see what their considerations might be. They might have different opinions. They might also have a different experience of the application. Especially on the product side. Because they're going to be the ones, if it's a client application, they're going to be the ones potentially like dealing with user feedback, either from analytics and metrics or from talking to the clients directly. So definitely like get that team feedback and then get a consensus together with the team that you're going to work with on this effort for how you're going to build this. Don't just go in and say, oh, you know what, I really didn't like these services, so I just went ahead and rewrote them all. And I think a lot of people here are probably familiar with the concept of like silent heroics and how that's really not a good thing for a company, for team morale, even for us as individual programmers to just go in and like fix stuff because it irritates us and then not tell anybody about it. And then you move on to another team or another company or someone else jumps into your project and they're like, what the hell is this? And then they go through the Git diffs and they're like, asshole. I've had that happen. I worked on a greenfield project for the aforementioned Daily Deals company, and the guy would stay up sometimes till 2 in the morning. And we get in the following morning at 9 o'clock. He'd already be up. I don't know what this guy did. I don't think he was on drugs, but maybe. He lived in Boulder, so it's possible. And we would see multi-hundred line diffs in pull requests. And we'd be like, dude, what the hell did you do? He's like, oh, I just got really excited and decided this needed to be rewritten. And we're like, no, man, this is not cool. And so that dude ended up, first off working 80-hour weeks just kind of for his own benefit. But then the rest of us would basically have to change how we worked with the code base every couple of days because he just kept going in and changing shit all willy-nilly. And this was before MVP launched, so we were iterating really fast. So that kind of stuff can get really challenging. Just don't do it. Get your team involved, and even if you just need to like pull some random people together and be like, hey, does this bug you too? Sweet, we should talk about this, and maybe we can put something together. Because the best way to sell something is to sometimes ask for forgiveness, not permission. But go ahead and like get a game plan together first, so that way you can sell it better. Because you can't sell a product if you don't have a product yet. And so I think there's some pretty clear goals in mind when it comes to rewriting and refactoring. And some of them, you want to increase application stability. You want to be able to deploy your code and not like cross your fingers and be like, please don't break, please don't break, please don't break. And maybe even Jenkins is like reviewing your pull requests and like adding integrations to it, and it still like breaks random crap. Like, again, aforementioned Daily Deals site. Someone pushed up a code change and it actually made the buy button on every deal disappear. So that's stuff where it's going to pass right through your continuous integration testing engines and your unit testing. They didn't have behavioral testing. That was probably one of their issues. But yeah, buy button totally went away, and it's like, you're an e-commerce site. How could this happen? And so stuff like that should not be allowed to happen, and that's where like good behavioral testing coverage can come and kind of save your ass, or just quit having like core DOM elements depend on things like JavaScript, because the issue was that the JavaScript broke due to something else, which then caused the buy button to disappear. The other components here, you want the code to be maintainable, not just by yourself, but by other people. The people on your team, the people in the company. If you have to hand it off to a client later, they need to understand how the hell it works. And then also other people coming in the door later. You never know when you're going to have to like mentor an intern and explain to them what the hell you did 6 months ago. And that's always one of those moments where I start looking at my code with someone and then I'm like, oh, I could have done that better. Oh, I could have done that better too. Okay, let's not use this as an example. Let's look at something else. And then other things, just being as forward-thinking as possible, I think, is probably the overarching goal consideration here. Making sure that, that your code can be added to, that it can be maintained, that it may be able to accommodate further refactoring in the future without somebody spending like weeks and weeks and weeks and breaking everything. And so there's a lot of stuff that you can get into when it comes to making sure that you are working toward an ultimate end goal and not just going, all right, we're just going to start making incremental changes, and then you've got like one puzzle piece, but then you put it together in the bigger picture and you're like, oh, I just like made a different kind of spaghetti. You start with spaghetti, you end up with linguine, and you're like, sweet, this looks better, but it's kind of still the same thing. All right, so once you've got everyone together, kind of your Skunkworks team or your internal project team on board, you got to get the company on board typically, because a lot of companies don't just go, oh yeah, we'll just bill for whatever, and you can just kind of, do whatever you want, make the thing. And also, like, no one wants to stay up until 2 in the morning, probably. Like, if you do, I encourage you to question your life choices with working on refactoring a code base. And again, that goes back to secret heroics. You just don't want to do it. It's mean. For people like me who have hobbies outside work and want to do other things and not come into a shit show of diffs in the morning to have to review. So the main core component that you really want to consider is time and money savings, because that's what companies and businesses value. Most businesses, not all of them, but I'd say like a great majority, they don't care about your feelings, and they, some of them do care if their developers are frustrated, but they won't care enough until they see that they can save some money or save some time or save some pain, either with lessening employee turnover or making the code more stable so that they don't experience side or component outages that affect their ability to sell their products, stuff like that. So things you can do is, like I said, talk to teams, talk to the accounts team, talk to biz dev, talk to project management. See if you can get your hands on metrics. Run the site through performance testing tools and see if there's a correlation between site load time and user engagement. If your team maintains a wiki of site outages, take a look at that, start putting some numbers together and see, because at the Daily Deal site, we actually did a pretty good job there of when we would have a drastic outage, we would do a really quick post-mortem and throw it up on the company wiki, and we would get metrics on dips in site visits and purchases, and we could see the correlation of how they were directly related to things like site performance and site outages. If you're able to start working those metrics into your code base, it's super duper helpful to do that, because that gives you bargaining chips later, so that if you need to make core changes to that code base, you can say, hey, look, this is costing us a crap ton of money. If we just were able to do X, Y, and Z, we could get the product to a stable place and be able to keep our users engaged and keep money coming in the door. So that's the big selling point, to get companies on board with this whole thing. Also, give specific examples. Like I said, I had a change that should have taken probably 2 hours and it took me 3 days. Those are really powerful talking points to talk to your teams about, hey, look, there's a really big problem here. It's not that I'm completely stupid, it's that the code is completely stupid. So you can gather that kind of information, talk to other people who've worked on the product, see what their sticking points were, especially if someone that you know in the company has begged to get off that product for whatever reason. See what drove them out the door. Just start taking people to lunch, or actually even better, take them for a whiskey so they get really angry. And then you can really get that honesty out of them a little bit of what about that app is really pissing them off. And then see what kind of information you can find that hopefully backs them up, not just well, we were out drinking and he said that this part sucked, because that's probably not going to convince your director of engineering. I mean, it might, especially if you invite him out with you. And then you can get something in writing right there on the spot that it's okay to refactor the site, and then just go ahead and have him sign the bottom, and then just take it back in Monday morning and be like, dude, thanks, bro. But that's kind of a skeevy way to go about it. But I would totally do it. I'm not gonna lie. So I wish I had some good examples of some tools, and I've completely forgotten what they are. But definitely, Google Analytics is a good one. If you can also get your hands on A/B testing engines like Qubit, that's actually a good way to measure things like user engagement and just general performance tools that you can get out there where you can measure clicks on a certain button and then just start looking at different times on that. That kind of stuff can be super helpful. And then, for other examples, take a look at what best practices are now. Maybe a site that was written 3 years ago has super sweet code and it's written really well, except maybe it's in Angular 1.0. Or maybe it's in, a framework that doesn't exist anymore, or it's in a really old version of Rails. I haven't worked in Rails for a while, so I don't know what an old version is, 2.1, 2.2? I don't know. So take a look at that, see where potentially outdated code base is introducing vulnerabilities, either with performance or stability, or even security, maybe client information is compromised. See if you can find those really big picture considerations that can introduce really big red flags into the application, and that can really help you kind of sell people on a business perspective of, oh, hey, our user data might be compromised. We really need to fix this thing. And then you can use that as an engine to go sweet, we're going to rewrite all this code that I can't freaking stand. So, you've convinced your team, you've got people on board, you've kind of got a game plan. Now you need to know what you're getting into, because you could be entering a world of pain. And nobody wants that. So get your team and your goals together. Figure out what it is you want to do, how you want to do it, who's doing what. I try to treat rewriting or refactoring both basically you're a new team building a greenfield application. You want to reimagine this as something different than what it is. Even if it's just hey, everything's in the controllers, we need to break this into separate components. Or we have too much depending on the front end and we want to start using a server-side templating system, or we need to update the platform. It can be any number of things, but just make sure that everyone understands what the goals are and get everyone on board with that, because otherwise you're more or less going to recreate the same situation that got you into this mess in the first place, which is that people aren't communicating, people aren't all on the same page, and then if you don't know what the hell you're building and why, then there's really going to be like a tremendous breakdown, and people are just going to move off in different directions. The application may end up as something completely different, like you have a grocery cart and someone says, no, I want a car, so you give them like a really shitty car that kind of looks like a grocery cart. And it's like, no, that isn't what we agreed to do. So things you can do is like, make sure that the team is constantly communicating, do code reviews, do pair programming as much as you can with the team that's doing this, and then also make sure that you're circling back with the business component of your company, whether it's client or product, and ensure that you are still continuing to move in the right direction. And this is especially true of rewrites. If you're going to be tearing down a code base and making it fresh, you're essentially just like making a whole new application at that point. Maybe it has the exact same design, maybe it has the same user engagement, but at the end of the day, it's a totally different beast that you're creating here. The other thing, definitely like exercise caution. Fixing one thing might break 5 other things. Again, aforementioned daily deal sites. I inherited a homeless code base. It was called Stepford, and to me that was funny because it's like the Stepford child. And it totally was. It was this homeless code, no one had maintained it in years. Someone just kind of like quickly slapped it together in 6 months and then left the company. And somehow the company decided, oh, we just need to go ahead and use this as like our built from scratch front-end framework for all of our user interactions, because that's awesome. We can say that we departed from the norm. Guess what? Fucking sucked. We had entire site outages happen, sometimes for 36 hours at a time. Me and 3 other super smart, high-level, like senior director level engineers, we all had to get on Screen Hero multiple times and just go through that entire framework and figure out, how does it compile? How does it minify the files? How the hell does it even freaking work? And that just turned into a nightmare. And a lot of that was brought on by someone thinking, oh, I'm going to like consolidate the header into a single template, and then the users can log into their account and it's just from one place. They broke the account logins by doing that on several components of the site, because especially when you're in an application using service-oriented architecture, I've worked at companies that had more apps than they had developers that just came together to make a single site. And so when that happens, you might have to change your code in 7 or 8 different places. And so it's a good candidate for trying to refactor that into something more efficient, but unless you have a full scope of what it is that you're trying to do and where all of these different components are, you're going to totally screw yourself, and you're going to screw the users, and you're going to screw your teams. I didn't even break the damn thing. I just had inherited this project, and I was like, well, this is what it is. And it turned into, like probably 120 man hours used that particular week on a company that was basically like a sinking ship on fire, and everyone on it was on fire, and the bar was on fire, and everything was on fire. And so as a result, the company wasn't like super pleased that we had used all these man hours to try to fix this thing that it turned out was just like a couple lines of code. So yeah, there's that. And on that vein, don't get attached to your code base. Like, I've written stuff and I'm like, oh man, if this was a baby, I would totally keep it and not sell it. But at the same time, like, code becomes irrelevant quicker than you can snap your fingers. It could be irrelevant in 6 weeks. The client might go, oh, you know what, we really don't want this feature. You need to rip it out. And then all of a sudden you're like, I loved it. So there's that, and then also just remember that you are writing this for other people. You're not writing applications for your own cloud at the end of the day, right? It's cool to stick a feather in your cap and go, sweet, I improved this and this, and we saw these gains as a company, but at the same time, like, those are the bigger picture things that you need to think about, not necessarily about how to write, like, the most perfect, insanely awesome bubble sort that the world's ever seen, that maybe you're the only person who can figure that shit out. Definitely make sure that your code is human readable, that the users, it doesn't affect user engagement, that it doesn't introduce instabilities, or that it's not slow, because otherwise you're just actually like adding fuel to the fire of the fire that you're actually trying to fight, and then Hank Scorpio is going to show up and just like screw up everything. The other thing is question everything. I've worked for companies that were excellent at peer reviewing each other's code. We would almost get into fights over it. People would go, well, why'd you write it this way? It's better if you write it this way. And then people would go, well, I don't like it written that way. And it would almost turn into like a Stack Overflow thread with a whole bunch of drama, going all the way down the pull request inside of our GitHub, where people go, well, I wrote it this way because this is the best way that I figured, and I used it over here, so for sake of consistency, and someone's like, yeah, but it's still wrong. And fortunately, we were a distributed team, or I think there would have been like a lot of sternum punching within the organization. But at the same time, it's good to be questioned. We all ideally want to be better developers every single day. And so with that, you want to learn, you want to grow, you want to figure out newer, better, faster, more awesomer ways to do things. You want to pick up on new stuff. You want to absorb things from other people. I have learned stuff from interns, and I've learned stuff from directors. We all want to do that, and that needs to be reflected in the code that we write. And we also want to make sure that we are pushing that application toward the end game of either what the product team wants or what the client wants. Because at the end of the day, if you're writing super awesome code and it doesn't perform or the users can't use it, then it's basically totally worthless. So make sure that you're talking to your teams, communicating with them, and that you're questioning everything. You know, why does this feature even exist? Do the users even use it? Why are our models written this way? Why isn't our data layer separate? Why are we using front end for all of our templates instead of like ERV templates or something like that? This is always a great opportunity to take that step back and ask those questions that maybe you weren't able to ask because you walked into the project after it had already been built. Or like a situation that I recently came out of, the company more or less just wanted this like giant dog and pony show to show off to the company's CTO. They're like, hey, look, we're making the thing do the thing. And then it turned into that the entire code base needed a rewrite because once we actually added on the back-end API calls, the front-end code became moot. And we had to refactor the application, and the client actually got mega pissed about that because they said, what? We figured you were actually writing this the right way. And we're like, we didn't have a back-end. What do you want from us? We need to hard code stuff, so it looks like it's working. And so that kind of stuff came up, but there should have been more questions asked. You know, hindsight's always 20/20. But you know, moving forward, I've learned ask those questions at the beginning. Hey, do you need the dog and pony show right now? Can we spend 3 weeks architecting? Because maybe your CTO is smart enough to realize that that's a major consideration. And if you're hiring us for our expertise in this field, then we need to tell you how we're going to do things. Here's our software development life cycle. Here's the architectural considerations. Here are potential pitfalls if we just do what you say without questioning it. And so, you know, standing up for yourself and just asking all of the right questions, pertinent questions, that kind of stuff can carry you a really long way. One major danger of refactoring is that it might actually turn into a full rewrite. I have started to refactor mostly front-end applications and especially Angular, where basically once I started breaking things out into separate services, into separate directives, into just other files that handle user interactions and that kind of thing, and abstracting out functions, I realized, holy shit, I just rewrote 80% of this application inadvertently. And so when you're considering a rewrite versus refactor, gather as much data as you can about the current code base and how it works, and side-by-side comparison of what a refactor might look like and what a rewrite might look like, because doing your homework early on in the process will allow you to hopefully prevent having that pitfall. Because if you sold your team on, hey, I want to refactor, it'll take me maybe 30 to 40 hours, and then 4 weeks later you're still in that code base untangling it, that makes for a strong argument of never ever getting to do that in the future. So make sure that you cover your ass in that respect. Let's see. All right, next. So yeah, this comes into risk mitigation. There's a lot of risk involved, and things can go horribly, horribly, horribly wrong with risk. So after your team has agreed on approach, it's, like I said, it's really good to do your homework ahead of time. Side-by-side compare rewrite versus refactor. And then if your application doesn't have really good test coverage, do that first. Do behavioral testing if you have a strong front end, so that you can measure your user interactions and see what's going right, what's going wrong. Because as you're rewriting that, like I said, maybe the buy button falls off the page. a behavioral testing engine would have caught that immediately and it wouldn't have gone through and gotten pushed to production. Or the account login disappears, or the navigation disappears, things like that. So that is super helpful. And then your back-end testing too, your unit testing, make sure that all of your services are where they need to be, that your data is being pulled. And when you're testing, try to test with production data if you can. I know some places it's just more or less impossible. You have to test with your test data or your QA engines. But if at all possible, especially in this scenario, test with your production data if possible, because that way you can actually spot the true vulnerabilities, because sometimes I've found that production tables and test tables for data, they aren't a complete mirror of one another. User logins might be different, what APIs are returning might be different, data structures, stuff like that. And so to avoid those vulnerabilities, it's always a good idea just to try to test with production data. And then also get performance measuring in place if you can. Like look at what is being tracked in Google Analytics on the application currently. See where it can be better. See if you can track clicks more granularly. See if you can also do, if your site is slow on the front end, one thing that we did at the Daily Deal site was we did a lot of front-end performance testing. And my God, I don't remember the name of the company. It's essentially a dude running a device lab in his basement, but he gives you back metrics on your entire stack trace, how long request and responses take, way more robust than Google Chrome. And it will also give you testing data on Android devices, Apple devices, and then different types of browser and system combinations. So that will give you a baseline to start with. So that way you can know, as you're working on this code, if you're actually making gains. Because even if the code might look better, that doesn't necessarily even mean that it is. You could just be writing further legacy code into this application, but you think that it looks better because it suits your taste a little bit more. But that's not always the case, so it's good to just get that hard data of exactly what's going on. And again, A/B testing can also help with this process. We did that a lot at the Daily Deal site where we wanted to redo the checkout flow. And so we did a ton of A/B testing to make sure that users were getting all the way to the purchase point with a new checkout flow. And we did that just kind of randomly before we did a site-wide change and pushed that change up and pushed up that refactoring of the checkout flow. That kind of stuff can help a lot. Start with low-risk changes first. Don't go in and refactor your site login before you even know what's going on. Like refactor the footer, refactor how the product page is displayed, stuff like that. Stuff that's fairly low risk, and then you can move on to site logins, user dashboards, heavier lifting functionality, third-party integration, stuff like that. Because when that stuff breaks, it breaks pretty big time. And then you're stuck fixing the refactoring that you're trying to do, and you kind of just want to kill somebody. And then also, especially with a rewrite, make sure that you have a backup plan, because maybe the rewrite just doesn't work. You could spend 4 to 6 months doing a complete redux of a site. Maybe it just straight up doesn't work. You either can't get it to integrate with the services that you need, maybe your data layer just won't work with it. Always have a backup plan if you need to revert to that old code base, or if you need to just back up and actually start refactoring in small pieces versus having to do a full site rewrite. And make sure that you always have a way to migrate that old code base back over quickly and easily. Obviously CI engines are super helpful with that, and just make sure that you're actually using what I would recommend is, especially if you're using Git flow, check out a completely separate feature branch, things like that for a rewrite. So that way you're not having to go back and pull a really, really old SHA out of your code base and try to work against stuff like that, because that can break things further. And I can't think of really anything kind of worse than trying to fix major merge conflicts in Git. I think that actually might be my own personal hell. So yeah, it's just something you never want to do. Also, if you're refactoring, don't just fix stuff for the hell of it. If it's not broken, and by broken I don't mean broken on the site, but if the code really doesn't look wrong and it just kind of hurts you a little bit, maybe wait on that stuff. Do the stuff that definitely kind of fits the legacy code criteria or is completely unstable. Don't just be like, you know what, I don't like the way that function's written. Fuck that function, I'm going to rewrite this function. And then maybe something that's tying into that function, maybe the return value is something that another function that needs it isn't expecting, and then you've broken stuff. Don't do that. let's see here. All right, we've got a couple more minutes. Sweet, we're right on time. So, how do you prevent this kind of crap in the future? God, I love that guy. So one thing you can do is make sure that your team is doing retrospectives on projects. Because that will give you a guideline for mistakes that you've made in the past, and then you can turn that into wins in the future. And so one thing that I dealt with pretty recently was I was given a project where there was no architecture setup time. Like they wanted features delivered the week of the kickoff meeting. Part of our big talking point in the retrospective was, wow, we really should have demanded at least 2 to 3 weeks of initial architecture and discovery, and working closely with the client team, and in particular the UX team, to make sure that we actually knew what the hell we were building and why, and to find out what they wanted, and not just going, oh, well, you know, this one director really wants to see this feature working, so you better like build a feature and make it work, or you really need to get this interface put together, and it's like, well, we want to make sure that as we're moving forward, you know, we give you a product that you can actually stand behind and build. And the end result of that project was we handed it off to the client. They brought in their own developers, and the developers said, "What the fuck did you do?" We're like, "We made the clicks work. What do you want from us?" And so, you know, trying to pad that time in the beginning is super helpful, and that worked pretty well for the Daily Deal site. We spent, I think, 4 weeks of project kickoff just on architecture. We built out all the separate gems that we needed. We built out the entire front end kind of basic structure that we needed. I collaborated with the mobile team to make sure that if we wanted to share resources, that we knew what those were. And it made all the difference in the world. We worked a ton of hours to get that project to MVP launch, but at the end of the day, it was stable and it's still being used, and the front-end engineer that took over my component is actually still able to work in that code base, and the back-end people who took over can still work in that code base. So that's a really big win when you can build something pretty hastily, but still have it working and extendable in the future. The other thing, you know, make sure that you're actually involving your team in the stuff that you're doing. Peer reviews, code reviews, pair programming, all that stuff is super important. Don't just try to like work in a silo. People have different opinions. People are going to question stuff. Hopefully, you can question other people. Like, you know, I think when you're working on a team as programmers, we're all kind of each other's accountability partners. We just, for me personally, when people ask me why I did something a certain way, it makes me kind of stop and think about, well, wait, why did I do it that way? And, you know, one thing that's helpful is, you know, don't get all bristly and protective of your code. If someone's asking a question, it's because A, they don't understand it. Maybe they're just being an argumentative dick. Like, there are some people like that, but then you can just go like, I just wrote it this way, let's go to lunch. Even if it's like 10 in the morning. But at the end of the day, there's this, oh man, what's it called? I think it's called Harkin's razor, which is assume ignorance, not malice, when things go wrong. And I assume that when people ask questions, that it's actually that they don't know and they want to know, not that they're trying to prod on me and make me feel poorly about the code that I wrote. And so I try to do my best, you know, just try to like play ball and answer questions and ask questions of other people. And don't be douchey about it, because nobody likes that. But you know, just say like, hey, it might be better if you rewrote this way. I became a really good Ruby developer in like 6 months because people kept asking me questions about the code that I wrote and saying, oh, hey, check out this Stack Overflow, it shows a different way to do this. So that kind of stuff is good. Just keeping your team accountable, because otherwise it's easy to like fall down the rabbit hole and kind of put on the blinders and the noise canceling headphones and just kind of build stuff the way that you want to build it. But that might not be the best way for your team, it might not be the best way for your client, it might not be the best thing for the product in the future. So that's a really important thing. Another big one, do your work like refactoring is not an option later, because sometimes it's not. I've worked in situations where we're iterating so fast that the tech debt just gets 100% shoved off to the side. And I've come into companies where they have 4 years of tech debt that's built up over that time. And literally no one has time to work on it. It just is the nature of the beast. And so, you know, it's like work like you are drawing with a Sharpie marker, not with a pencil. You're entering a point of no return. And so by that token, you know, if you have the time with the project, make sure that you just write the code in the best way possible. Or if you are struggling with a particular component of like, oh, I think I could write this a little more abstract, or I could separate this out a little bit better, just grab somebody. It could be an intern, it could be a director, like everybody's got opinions. And just say like, hey, does this look right or wrong to you? And then just kind of talk it out a little bit, or do some rubber ducking, either with an actual rubber duck or with a person or a glass of whiskey or find a cute little dog, I don't know, whatever works for you. And then the other thing that I have tried to do in the past is actually make small fixes, either in my own code or if I was working with people who didn't have a tremendous ego behind what they did, make small fixes in their code as I was working on an app. So I'd be working in a JavaScript file and see that there was a chunk of logic that existed in 6 different places. I can just break that out into a separate function and make it return something. And so I would just do that. And it's like, sweet, I just eliminated several lines of code and made this reusable thing that we can do later. So look for those little ways to just kind of improve stuff incrementally over time. And that kind of stuff will save you, hopefully, from having to do a lot of refactoring or rewriting an application on down the road. Thanks! Sweet, rounds up. It's like a silent dog. Oh god, I thought it was a cat. I was like, holy shit. Someone's got a cat in the office. So here's where to find me in places: the tweeters, the Instagrams, the emails, and then that's my username for the Denver Dev Slack channel. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
What about documentation when you rewrite?
Yes. Documentation actually is very important. That's a good point. I would say even before you dive into a rewrite or a refactor, start documenting the current state of the application. That way you can refer back to it as you're working through it, especially if documentation doesn't exist. If there is some documentation already, go through and audit that. See if somebody either half-assed it or if it's really old and is no longer relevant. Then save that old documentation even when you're doing the refactoring. Maybe document what you did, why, the considerations, what it looks like moving forward, and add to that as you move along, and make sure that the documentation is getting updated. But I would say, I've worked at companies that basically just overwrote their documentation, but especially if you have to roll that code back, then you've destroyed all your old documentation, and now your documentation doesn't match the code base. So that's important. And I think, especially if you're in a large organization, having an internal wiki is super helpful for stuff like this, because then other people can contribute easily without having to necessarily put in a pull request on the code base. Because I've worked at places that kept the documentation as a markdown file but wrote with the code, which is one way to do it. But I think having an external wiki is helpful, because that way if A, GitHub goes down, or B, the project goes away, or something happens to that file, you still have the documentation in a central location you can work with. Yes?
Are your slides posted somewhere?
I'm sorry?
Are your slides posted somewhere?
I can post them somewhere.
That would be awesome.
I will do that. And there will be a video that Mike is taking. Yay, Mike! Anybody else? Otherwise, I'll turn you loose.
You notice that it's common with, when there's a lot of text that people end up just rewriting anyway, just to avoid having to deal with any of that. They're writing in Sharpies, so then they just throw it all away and rewrite it all.
Yeah, there's definitely, that does happen. And I think sometimes, I've known some people who just, I call them coding masochists, and they just like to rewrite stuff because they enjoy the puzzle as well as the pain of trying to like make something work a different way just for the hell of it. Yes?
You mentioned when starting your process of either refactoring or rewriting, you mentioned hello test coverage. What if you have none?
See if you can sell your team on adding test coverage before you start the process. It's kind of a pain in the ass to add tests to existing code, but it can be done. It's kind of a bummer. But I would highly recommend, if there's time and if you can sell it, even if you just do some basic stuff, like making sure that return data is as expected, API calls are working, and that core components of the site for behavioral testing is working, like the login button, a buy button, log out, stuff like that. Just see if you can even add some simple stuff like that just as a springboard and a starting point. And then that's another also a really good argument for doing a rewrite or a refactor is if you have no test coverage, you can say like, hey, we don't have test coverage. How many outages do we have? Do we know why? Hell no, we don't. So that kind of stuff can be helpful. Yes?
How do you sell a client who's got like a mental brick wall on rewriting?
Man,
Like, let's say they had an experience before the developer would
Yep.
rewrote something and they just had such a bad experience, they don't want to rewrite anything.
Get a new client.
Like the stakeholder
There-
loves the code.
yeah, there's some really good counselors out there that help people overcome victimhood, bad relationships that repeat. But no, seriously, the thing that I would do is see if you can spin it with the time and the money savings component. Find out from your account people maybe like how much you're billing the client and how much time you've lost on that kind of BS. And then also if you have working examples within your organization of times that you have rewritten and refactored apps, or not even you personally, but other teams have done this for a client and been successful, just take as many tools as you can and give them kind of this artillery of arguments. At the end of the day, they still might not want to do it, and then you just have to go, well, you know what, screw it, we tried our best. And sometimes rewriting is not in the client's best interest, either because they're unwilling to pay for it or because they don't even really know their own product, which does happen. And so things like that can go down. But I would say just make as many carefully crafted arguments as you can with as much supporting evidence as possible, and essentially just like take them a court case file and say like, hey, this is important and here's why. And here's what we can do for you. And then also bring up like some hypothetical scenarios, maybe even put together a quick proof of concept in a day with your group and say, hey, here's what it could be like if we were able to do this rewrite or this refactor, and here's what it means for you. Yes?
On the top of one of your slides, you said that you taught yourself HTML in GeoCities at 16.
Yes.
I was wondering what your first site
somebody
was.
saw those, yay!
I was wondering what your first site was, or first couple sites.
Let's see here. My first site was a personal site. It was like yellow with the neon green, like typical GeoCities colors. And then I built a ton of fan sites for 90s bands. At the same time, like they're probably out there somewhere. They're horribly embarrassing. But yeah, those were my first endeavors. Like lots of tables and those 3D bullets and crap.
I did the same thing at the same age.
Nice.
Yes, Dragon Ball Z website.
Yeah, exactly. It was like that, except with like the band Bush, probably, or something like that.
It's awesome.
Anything else? All right, cool. You have an extra 5 minutes to walk to your next session. Thank you all so much.